Thank you very much for inviting me to this great meeting and giving us the opportunity to address methane emissions and talk about measurements to mitigation. So, just not everyone knows Picarro. Picarro is a technology and service provider based in California in the Silicon Valley, but we do have offices and operations in Europe. And we provide solutions to distribution grid operators for compliance leak survey and methane emission measurements, methane emission quantifications. Normally when you see a Picarro talk, there are a lot of graphs and data, and it's rather complex with a lot of figures and numbers. I stayed away from that and tried to give an introduction into the upcoming panel, where I think a lot of the topics I'm going to briefly address will be discussed in much more detail. So when we talk about methane emissions and mitigation, what are we actually talking about? Well, according to some dictionary, mitigation is a reduction in how harmful, undesirable, or bad something is. I think we can all agree that methane emissions are harmful for the environment. Methane is a very strong greenhouse gas, and on a short time scale, it contributes to global warming more than CO2 on a molecule level. So it's harmful for the environment. Methane emissions are also undesirable for business. First and foremost, because it's a loss of commodity. I think we rather want to sell the natural gas to industry, to end consumer, rather than losing it to the atmosphere. But it's also undesirable for business because methane emissions, if they stem from natural gas leaks, can provoke odor calls, which often require an emergency response by the distribution operator, which is a very costly exercise. So it's undesirable for business. And methane emissions can also be bad for safety. Natural gas leaks are a safety hazard, a potential safety hazard. Now, not all methane emitters are the same. There is a fraction of the methane emitters which is in the intersection of being harmful, being undesirable for business, and potentially bad for safety. And it's a small intersection, it's a small part of the methane emitters, and this is the large methane emitters. So how can we mitigate these? How can we mitigate their impact? Well, at Picarro we have developed solutions to detect and mitigate methane emissions through measurements. Measurements can tell us how many large emitters are there. And the data tell us it's only 2 to 5% of all the leaks which can be considered large. But they contribute between 20 to 50% of the total emissions. So only measurements can tell us that. Next, measurements can also tell us where do we have these large emitters. In fact, these large emitters can be found anywhere on the grid. Actually, they are more likely to be found on bad and old parts of the distribution grid. But they are difficult to find because it's like looking for the needles in a haystack. There are only very few of these large emitters. As mentioned, 2 to 5% of the leaks are considered large. And again, only measurements can tell us where we have the large emitters. So we need measurements to find them, to know how many of the large emitters exist. We need measurements to detect these large leaks and to quantify them. Addressing methane emissions through mitigation is what we do at Picarro. These are our solutions. And I like to suggest to look at it as an opportunity. We all know there's a regulation coming our way, which means it's not just an opportunity, it's a requirement to measure and mitigate methane emissions. But from our point of view, and the point of view that I would like to share with you, I think it's an opportunity. Mitigating methane emissions is an opportunity to the industry because you can actually reduce the environmental impact. This is a really big deal. As an industry, you have the tools and the opportunity to reduce the environmental impact of the business, to slow down global warming on a short time scale, in particular when we talk about methane. Secondly, mitigating methane emission helps to reduce customer odor calls and helps to reduce emergency responses. Emergency responses are expensive, and therefore if you can reduce these expenses, you can reduce operational costs. And almost as a side effect, removing large leaks from the network help to increase network safety. By measuring and by using measurements for mitigation, we can also increase the accuracy of emissions reporting, which is important for all the members of the oil and gas methane partnership, but it's important for everyone, I would suggest. Because using measurements and increasing accuracy of emissions reporting helps also to increase transparency. And transparency is needed. We need transparency to the investors, to the regulators, authorities, but also to the end consumer. We need to show that we do as much as we can to improve the situation and reduce the negative impacts of the business. This also creates a transparent and credible way towards net zero. And if we talk about net zero, well, at some point we'll need to move away from fossil natural gas if we want to reach net zero. But we do have an existing, expensive, and very well-functioning natural gas infrastructure. And in my view, we should and we probably have to continue to use this infrastructure during the transition, but maybe also beyond, and probably beyond net zero. But if we want to use this infrastructure beyond net zero, we're going to have to move away from fossil natural gas and, for example, use hydrogen. It was mentioned before. So by mitigating methane emissions today, we can also create a proof point of the so-called hydrogen readiness. Again, increasing transparency to authorities, end consumers, investors, that there is a future, and that there is a future with fewer emissions, with a safer network, and there's even a future beyond net zero in a decarbonized world. So I'm going to stop here. I am open for a few questions before we would move to the panel about the same topic, but where you get hopefully a bit more in depth into all these important aspects. So thank you very much for the question. I on purpose didn't go into too much details about what we are actually doing, but we're providing a vehicle-based system. So we have a very high sensitive system, measurement system in a car, which drives according to a certain protocol an entirety of the gas distribution grid and detects the location of leaks and can also measure or quantify the size of the leak. And together, the detection and the quantification of all the leaks existing on the network provides an emission quantification on the total network. So the most cost-efficient mitigation path that our clients have pursued is really the focus on the large emitters. If you think about a network, there are many small leaks. There are very few large leaks, only 2 to 5%. That's true globally. We have data from all over the world. And we see everywhere more or less the same distribution. Every distribution operator can focus on 2 to 5% of the leaks. That's a relatively small amount of the leaks. But it has a big impact in emissions reduction. If you prioritize these leaks and repair them very, very rapidly, you can drastically reduce the emissions in a short amount of time. And I'm sure we're going to hear an example of our Italian client, Italgas, who has achieved tremendous results by doing so. Thank you very much for your attention.